Now gold is not enough.
Tá ótimo, gente. Então, sejam todos muito bem-vindos aqui ao nosso webinário Crise de Credibilidade na Indústria. É uma alegria recebê-los aqui hoje. Eu tenho certeza que a gente vai ter hoje uma manhã de muita troca, de muitas reflexões sobre os grandes acidentes que têm ocorrido na indústria, sobre o impacto que esses acidentes têm trazido nas várias dimensões, na dimensão humana, na dimensão ambiental e na dimensão social. E a gente vai pensar também na crise de credibilidade que muitas das vezes não apenas uma organização, mas toda uma indústria mergulha após a ocorrência de um grande acidente como esse. A gente vai ter a chance hoje de dar um passo atrás e refletir acerca das nossas organizações e de todos os arranjos que existem nas nossas organizações, sobre os quais a gente raramente pensa, mas que moldam o nosso comportamento e que acabam definindo como as coisas são feitas dentro da organização. Isso tem um impacto à segurança. E a gente vai dar um passo atrás também e vai perceber que as nossas organizações elas não vivem num mundinho isolado. Elas estão atuando dentro de uma sociedade, dentro de um ambiente, e a governança dessas organizações precisa cada vez mais conseguir construir um diálogo com todas as partes interessadas, né? Já não dá mais para a gente ter empresas que têm como único propósito a geração de valor para um único stakeholder, que é o acionista, sem pensar nos demais. Então, é sobre isso tudo que a gente vai estar hoje falando. Para quem não me conhece, meu nome é Gilza Monteiro, eu venho atuando há mais de 18 anos na indústria de óleo e gás, na área de segurança de processo e análise de risco. Junto com vários colegas aqui, organizei esse evento, né, junto com o Alexandre Glitz, o Hugo, que já falou aqui com vocês, a Carmen Migueles. O Glitz tem mais de 30 anos de experiência na indústria de óleo e gás, tive a alegria de tê-lo como meu gerente de segurança na Petrobras, e hoje ele atua como consultor em gestão de riscos industriais. O Hugo atualmente é consultor de EHS na ICL Brasil, e como ele falou, é super conhecido de vocês pelo canal que ele tem no YouTube, o Segurança Diferente, que inclusive tem uma entrevista com o professor Hopkins que vale a pena conferir. E a Carmen Migueles, que é doutora em Sociologia das Organizações, é professora na FGV e também muito querida e muito conhecida de todos vocês. Mas a gente não está aqui sozinho. A gente está aqui com um time de peso, um time de ouro, de profissionais extremamente gabaritados, profundos conhecedores dos temas que eles estão trazendo aqui, seja da academia, seja na indústria, com muita experiência também na indústria. E conforme eles forem entrando para fazer as apresentações, a gente vai dando mais detalhes e apresentando eles para vocês, mas desde já registro meu agradecimento a todos vocês que de pronto aceitaram o convite para embarcar na organização desse evento conosco. Bom, de onde surgiu a ideia de fazer esse evento, né? A ideia de fazer esse evento, sem sombra de dúvida, ela surgiu depois da nossa leitura do livro do professor Hopkins, Credibility Crisis, que inclusive deu nome ao evento, onde ele conta toda a jornada que ele teve ao participar de um painel de especialistas para a construção de um padrão global de gerenciamento de barragem de rejeito. Essa foi uma iniciativa que não partiu da indústria, essa iniciativa partiu de um grupo de investidores, a indústria fez parte, teve seu papel fundamental, mas foi uma iniciativa do grupo de investidores depois da crise de credibilidade na qual mergulhou a indústria de mineração após a ocorrência do acidente de Brumadinho. E a gente percebeu que o livro ele tem vários aspectos que afetam a segurança e a prevenção de grandes acidentes nas nossas organizações, que não se limitam ao segmento de mineração, mas que devem ser questões pensadas por todas as indústrias onde existe potencial de acidente catastrófico. E daí que surgiu a ideia da gente fazer essa roda de conversa hoje. O evento ele vai ter 3 grandes blocos, com intervalinhos de 10 minutinhos entre eles, para não ficar pesado para ninguém. O primeiro bloco vai ser agora em inglês, já eu vou estar mudando para outro idioma, para convidar o professor Hopkins, ele vai contar um pouco para a gente sobre esse livro. As perguntas de vocês, como o Hugo colocou, né, a interação vai ser via chat, então vocês podem colocar as perguntas no idioma que vocês se sentirem mais confortáveis. O Hugo e a professora Carmen, depois na sessão de perguntas e respostas, vão se virar nos 30 aí para pegar as perguntas de vocês e colocar para o professor Hopkins. Na sequência, a gente vai ter um bloco com 2 grandes temas. O tema 1 que é uma palestra da Solange Guedes. Solange tem mais de 30 anos de experiência na indústria de petróleo, foi diretora de exploração e produção da Petrobras, e ela vai abordar um tema, né? Eu não sabia. É uma frase que, volta e meia, a gente escuta das altas lideranças de uma organização depois da ocorrência de um grande acidente. Então, afinal, qual é o papel da governança corporativa e como é que essa governança pode ajudar na prevenção de acidentes? A Solange vai abordar esse tema com maestria. Na sequência, a gente vai ter a Magda. A Magda também tem enorme experiência na indústria de óleo e gás, tanto na Petrobras quanto na Agência Nacional do Petróleo. Né? Ela atuou no regulador, ela ocupou diversos cargos, inclusive de diretora técnica e diretora-geral, e vai trazer um pouquinho a discussão do papel do regulador, como garantir auditorias de segurança independentes e efetivas, e, afinal, quem fiscaliza a indústria de óleo e gás. E no último bloco, a gente vai ter a professora Carmen e o professor Éder. O professor Éder é pesquisador na área de gestão de segurança e fatores humanos da PUC, Rio Grande do Sul. E eles vão abordar o tema do impacto à segurança dos sistemas de remuneração variável e uso de indicadores. E no finalzinho, a gente vai ter uma mesa redonda com todos os palestrantes. O Hopkins não vai poder participar dessa mesa redonda por causa da diferença de fuso, né? Ele está 13 horas na frente da gente lá na Austrália, mas todos os outros palestrantes vão estar conosco nessa mesa redonda, que vai ser moderada pelo Eduardo. Eduardo tem aí mais de 30 anos de experiência na parte de mineração, siderurgia, e também é bem conhecido aí da turma pelo canal Dr. Safety, que ele fundou no YouTube. E a Thaís Laguardia, que é a head de sustentabilidade da empresa Nexa Resources. E eles vão fazer aí um trabalho de tentar pegar as perguntas que a gente não conseguir encaixar, porque depois toda apresentação vai ter uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. O que eventualmente a gente não conseguir encaixar no momento da apresentação, eles vão estar trazendo para essa mesa redonda. Então, participem, coloquem as suas questões, seus comentários, para que a gente possa trazê-los para a discussão. Eu vou mudar agora para o inglês. So now I'm switching to English. To welcome Professor Hopkins, and first, thank you very much for being here with us. In fact, I think it's an honor to have you here with us to share a little bit of the story of your new book, Credibility Crisis. And let me just say a few words to introduce you. So Professor Hopkins, he's a sociologist. He's an emeritus professor at ANU, the Australian National University, which is located in Canberra. Canberra is the capital of Australia. And I think I can say that most of his work has been focused on the human and organizational factors of major accidents in different industrial segments, such as the mining, oil and gas, chemical plants. And he was a consultant to the US Chemical Safety Board in its investigation of the BP Texas City refinery disaster, which occurred in 2005. And then in the investigation of the Macondo accident. And he has written books about these accidents with over 100,000 copies sold. And I highly recommend these books. And I was very pleased to work with him for 1 year in Australia during my PhD, when we had the chance to discuss the topic of organizational structures and their influence on culture. And he has published a book about this topic, Organizing for Safety, How Structure Creates Culture, which I also highly recommend. So, Andrew, thanks a lot for being here with us. You're going to have 25 minutes to present, and then 10 minutes of questions and answers. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Gilsa. Yeah, if I can mention, that last book that Gilsa mentioned also has a chapter which she jointly wrote with me. So that was a very fruitful collaboration. Okay, yes, I just want to repeat that I'm a sociologist, and what does that mean about me? I'm interested, just a little bit of background about the way I approach the world. I'm concerned about power and power inequalities. I'm concerned about the rights of people, disadvantaged people in particular. So I'm concerned about the rights of people who are affected by tailings dams. I'm also interested in organizations and how they function and how they behave and how they fail. Organizational failure is a very important theme in all of my work. And so I have a particular interest in major accidents, as Gilles has said. And my question then is, what is it about the way these organizations operate that gives rise to these accidents? That's the fundamental question of a lot of my work. Okay, so that's just who I am in a thumbnail sketch. I want to, though, talk to you about this topic, so I'm going to see if I can share my screen with you. I think is it there now? Yeah. Okay, so Credibility Crisis is the name of the book that I wrote, Brumadinho and the Politics of Mining Industry Reform, jointly written with another sociologist, Deanna Kemp, who is at the University of Queensland, also in Australia. So here's what happened. The Brumadinho failure created a real crisis for credibility in the mining industry. It should never have happened. So how could anybody trust the claims of the mining industry to be safe after Brumadinho, coming so close on the heels of San Marco? And in particular, investors. Now, investors are a very important part of this story because they invest in these big companies. And if they feel those companies are not safe, then their money's not safe, and they're not going to invest in those companies. So this was a crisis for the mining industry because the investors were threatening to withdraw their investments. Now, the peak body of the mining industry, the Industry Association, Peak Industry Association, is called the International Council of Mining and Metals. And it took the view that this crisis required that it had to act. It decided to create a standard for the management of tailings dams worldwide. This peak body, the ICMM has about, I think, 28 members, all the big mining companies around the world, including Vale. Vale is a member of the ICMM. So they decided they'd create a standard, but they realized it couldn't be just an industry created standard because that wouldn't give them any credibility. They needed to have some non-industry partners. And so they invited two other organizations to join with them to create the tailings management standard. And they were here's the ICMM, then the United Nations Environment Programme was a co-sponsor of the standard, and PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a group of large investors investing trillions of dollars in various, particularly in the mining industry. So these were the three co-sponsors of the standard, and the ICMM had invited those other two to give this standard some some credibility. Of course, there then was a drafting group, a group of people, of experts to draft the standard, and I was on that standard because on that drafting group because of my interest in major accidents. It was a highly political process. The conflict between these groups was intense. The conflict between the drafters, myself, for example, and the ICMM was intense. And the book describes that process. So I'm not going to talk about that now, but it's a fascinating story of conflict and compromise. The result of it, however, was a standard, the Global Industry Standard on Tailings Management, which was published in August of last year, available at globaltailingsreview.org. Now, this is, as I say, a worldwide standard. It was produced in multiple languages, including Portuguese. So there's the standard in Portuguese. So that was, they've divided their dams into the dangerous ones and the less dangerous ones. And they've all agreed, all the members of the Industry Association agreed that they would comply with the standard in relation to their dangerous dams by the 5th of August 2023, and for the rest of their dams by the 5th of August 2025. Okay, so the importance of this is that all the member companies of the International Council are committed to comply with this. One of the big issues here is what's the enforcement process, and I will talk about that in a minute. But the major companies are committed to comply with this standard. And what that means is that the standard provides an opportunity to hold companies like Vale to account, to ask questions publicly and expect answers from them. Now, the standard contains a variety of public disclosure requirements. Citizens groups and stakeholders are able to ask companies like Vale to provide information about how they are managing particular tailings dams. So they can ask them, how dangerous are these dams on a certain scale? That's an important question. How dangerous are these dams? And you are doing safety audits. What are the results of your safety audits? These are things which the public is now entitled to ask of these companies. And that's what it really means to hold them to account. So I've said why those 28 can be treated in that way, can be asked these questions, because they have committed themselves to comply with the standard. But what about all the other mining companies? What's the story there? How can they be made to comply with the standard? And there are two possible mechanisms. One is investor pressure, which I mentioned earlier. That investors may say, unless you comply with the standard, we are not going to invest in you. That's a very powerful lever. And if the investors are willing to use that lever, that will really make a very big difference. So far, investors haven't made that as a condition of their investment, but it may still come. Another possibility is that state regulators may endorse the standard and require that all the companies under their jurisdiction comply with that standard. So, for example, your own national mining agency might require that all companies, mining companies, comply with the standard, and the agency might then audit the companies against the standard. That was our hope. It hasn't happened yet, but it's early days, and we will see. I don't know if that's a political possibility in Brazil, that the regulator might endorse the standard, but it's certainly worth asking whether they would do so. Now, I want to talk about just a couple of what I regard as the remarkable features of the standard. I've already mentioned public disclosure. The two others I want to mention. First of all, that the standard provides rights to people affected by tailings dam projects. In particular, people like indigenous people in Brazil and the Quilombola, who I've recently discovered. I didn't know of them until very recently. So it provides rights to these people, human rights. And this is not something the mining companies want. The very first requirements in the standard are about acknowledging the human rights of these people. The companies were very unhappy about this. They fought hard against having these rights included in the standard, but they didn't succeed on that. And so there are these requirements. So here is one, that to demonstrate that project-affected people are meaningfully engaged in decisions about their safety. That's one of the requirements in the standard. They must demonstrate that. So clearly the key term here is meaningfully engaged. I mean, what does that mean? Unless we can give some clear meaning to that, then that requirement will be an empty requirement. So there is an additional definition in the standard what meaningfully engaged means. And it means, for example, that the companies must ensure that local people provided with resources to get to meetings, to talk about their interests and to talk to the company. The company must pay for transportation to get these people to these meetings. The company must provide literature in easily understood language and possibly in a local language, their local indigenous language. The company must ensure that they understand the technical issues, and the company must document how they are doing all of this. So that's what meaningful engagement means. And you can then audit that and ensure, theoretically, you can ensure that this meaningful engagement really is taking place. So here's another one of these requirements. Where a new tailings facility may impact the rights of Indigenous or tribal people, the company must work to obtain and maintain free, prior and informed consent, often known as FPIC. I won't use that abbreviation here, but it's a very commonly used abbreviation. Now, this is an important requirement. Notice that it's not enough for the company to have the approval of governments, state governments or local governments. The consent of local Indigenous people is also relevant. And not only must it be consent, it must be informed consent. They must know what it is they're consenting to. They must understand what they're consenting to. It must be prior. It must be given before any construction, any work begins. And it must be free, that is uncoerced. So these are important ideas, and we're picking up on some UN standards, United Nations standards in this way. So that looks good. However, I want to draw your attention to these words, work to obtain and maintain. It's not that the companies must obtain and maintain this consent, they must work to obtain and maintain it. What that means is, if they try but fail, that's good enough. They've worked, they've tried to get the consent, but they haven't succeeded in getting the consent. As long as they've tried, then that is good enough. So that is a real let out, and this is one of the major compromises that we can see in the standard. The compromise between the companies on the one hand not wanting to be constrained, and others who were wanting to ensure that these requirements, these rights really meant something. So you can see that conflict embedded in the wording in the standard. It's really important that these be made to work as best as possible, because this is the opportunity for Indigenous people, the representatives of Indigenous people, or the NGOs, the non-government organisations, to challenge the mining companies to ensure that they are not violating the rights of these people. The second inclusion that I wanted to mention that's in the standard, which is to me a surprising one, surprising inclusion, is in the area of governance, how these mining companies are governed, how they are organised. The requirements here were fiercely resisted by the industry. They felt that we had no right to be interfering in what they regarded as their own internal affairs, in how they organised themselves. But it's very clear that governance is a critical issue, critical to preventing major accidents, not only in the mining industry, but in oil and gas and other industries. And the reason that it is so important is that it seems to be a feature of all major accidents that the people at the top had no idea of how major accident risk was really being handled in the workplace. And so governance is a way in which you can ensure that the people at the top really do understand and are exercising some control over how that major accident risk is being handled. The situation for many companies is that it's not well handled at all, and accidents come as complete surprises to the senior executives and to the boards. They're completely unaware of what was going wrong in the company. And that was true of BP's Gulf of Mexico oil well blowout. It was true of Vale and its Brumadinho accident. Now, a director of Vale was interviewed sometime after the accident, and she said that the board of the company had been deceived misled by the reports that it was receiving from its senior management. The reports were full of good news about how well the risks were being managed, and the reality was quite different. And she's now far more aware of what was going on, and she believes that Vale's top management should have been much more skeptical. They should have assumed the worst rather than simply relying on the good news that was coming through to them. They should have had a sense of chronic unease. I use that term. It's a very commonly used term now, meaning simply a permanent a permanent sense of worry or doubt about how well you are managing your major accident risk. They should have had a sense of chronic unease. They needed better ways of informing themselves and ways to inquire more deeply about the safety of their dams. Because at Brumadinho, audits and reviews had for many years been raising questions about safety of dams, but that information was not passed up the line, and the board had no idea about those doubts. They were simply overlooked as the information passed up the organizational chain. And she said, this director said, if that information had got through to the board, the outcome would have been very different. If you're interested in this, there's an excellent report by Judge Northfleet, which, unlike most accident reports, deals with these organizational kinds of issues. She's a Brazilian judge. She lives in Rio de Janeiro, so I'm not sure why she has an English name, but it's an excellent report that you can find. It's obviously in Portuguese, but there is a 50-page summary in English on which I have relied. So if you're focusing then on governance, this is the key requirement in the standard, that the company must appoint an accountable executive, person who is responsible, an accountable executive, accountable for the safety of tailings facilities, not just for the creation of standards, but actually accountable for the safety of tailings facilities, and accountable to the CEO and also to the board of directors. So the idea is that this is kind of the connection between the top of the company and the bottom. This person must be in a position to find out what is going on and pass that news up the line. Putting it another way, the accountable executive must be able to reach down into the organization and bypass management to find out what is really happening. A very crucial idea. And this idea is relevant to all major accident industries. BP introduced this after its Gulf of Mexico accident. It appointed a vice president responsible for operational risk, which includes all major accident risks. And that person reports directly to the CEO. And that person, that VP for operational risk, has staff embedded in the business units. And that staff has their finger on the pulse. They know exactly what is going on in those business units, but they are not directly accountable within that business unit. They don't answer within the business unit. They answer up this outside line to the vice president responsible for operational risk. So they maintain an independence from the business unit and an ability, therefore, to really access that information and make sure it gets to the top. One last example of this I want to mention is Boeing. Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer Boeing, that after its 737 MAX aircraft crashed, two of them in 2018, 2019, it became clear there was a design problem, that the engineers were to some extent aware of this, but the engineers had been disempowered by being answerable to commercial line management. And so Boeing changed this. There was an agreement between Boeing and the prosecutor to change its organizational structure so that the engineers would now answer up an engineering line all the way to a chief engineer at the top of the company. They answered up that line. They didn't answer to the local business unit. And that gave them, that empowered them to take more ethical, more effective decisions in relation to safety. So it's a very important idea that this particular requirement in the standard. So I certainly hope it works. We get to see. And finally, the standard deals with systems of incentive payments or bonuses. Now, at Brumadinho, the managers and engineers received bonuses which depended on the financial success of the company and not on the safety of tailings facilities. And the result was that information about these reviews that I mentioned earlier, information about problems with safety of those tailings facilities was buried in the rush to get these facilities certified as safe. So one of the requirements in the standard is that where people have a role in tailings dam safety, that their bonuses should reflect their contribution to tailings dam safety, not just to the financial success of the mining company. How that's going to work out, I don't know, but it's fortunately this is again something which was much resented by industry. They didn't want us to make any kind of requirements about bonuses, but we managed to get something of this thinking into the standard, even though it was much watered down. And I think, just from my own personal point of view, it's the top executives of the company where the problem is most acute, because they have incredibly valuable bonuses, which are called long-term bonuses that are worth usually several times their salary. And those bonuses are based entirely on the financial success of the corporation and not on safety. And the standard says that these long-term bonuses should be made to depend to some extent on the safety of tailings dams. So we got something of that into the standard, but it's pretty clear to me that the big companies are not going to comply with that requirement. I won't develop that now, but that's pretty clear what the outcome is going to be. So the standard is not perfect by any means, but I think it does provide interest groups, in particular project affected people, with some leverage, some capacity to hold these companies to account. It won't be easy, and they will need the help of non-government organizations and governments, but it's a step in the right direction. Let me stop there, and we can take questions or proceed in any way you wish.
Hello, Professor Hopkins. We have 3 questions so far. One of them is from Glitz. He is asking you, how can we really assure the bad news reach the top, besides having, of course, all the mechanisms you say, internally in the corporation, we still have lots of borders and difficulties to make information flow to the top. Have you think of something internally in the corporation that could facilitate that?
Yes, I've seen this done in some organizations which are sometimes described as high reliability organizations. In particular, air traffic control, which is this organization which I've studied in Australia. The key to this is, I think, that when people make reports, they must be made electronically, and they must go automatically, not only to local people, but they must go automatically to the top of the corporation. There must be an independent health and safety agency within the organization to whom these reports go. And that independent agency must be able to evaluate and assess this bad news, and in particular cases, pass it on to the executive committee or the CEO for action. Unless you have that, if you like, that really fast transmission of information to the top, if you rely on information going up step by step, it may never get there. So you need this direct line to the top if you are going to ensure that the bad news gets there. What you really need is top leaders who are committed to this idea and who will say to everybody, I want the bad news, give me the bad news. And if you give me only the good news, this will not be acceptable. You must also give me the bad news. That's the ideal situation where your leadership is leading in that way. But that organizational strategy, which I talked about, of making sure that the information moves rapidly to the top of the corporation electronically and is accessed and evaluated at that level is an organizational solution to this problem.
Thank you very much.
Professor, there is an interesting question over here. If you were, for example, if you had the power to work for the Brazilian regulation, what would you do? What would be the most effective approach to address those questions with the industry in order to protect the country and the community assets?
If I was the head of the Brazilian, well, an obvious strategy is to enact this standard, make it part of Brazilian law, and then to enforce it. And it needs external enforcement. It needs external auditors and people to ensure that it is being observed, because it is a good standard. One of the questions that somebody asked me was, would the standard have prevented Brumadinho from occurring? And the answer is, if Vale had been, my answer would be, if Vale had the problem at the moment, there is no reliable enforcement mechanism. And that's where I think the role of the state really comes in to ensure compliance with the standard.
Thank you, Professor. There's
Thank you.
another question. It seems that leaders need to challenge the green and embrace the red. Do you believe it can be made something like not only to easy talk, but we can structurally provoke these sort of embracement?
Well, yeah, I think I talked about this to Petrobras about 2 nights ago. So it's a familiar theme. As I said just a minute ago, what you really want is for leaders to lead in this respect, and to challenge the good news and to embrace the bad news. But if your leaders are neutral, are not committed, what can you do? I think the organization needs to have systems to challenge the good news. You know, to say, when people provide good news, what is the evidence? To insist on knowing what is the evidence that this is green. And I think there should be a requirement that when people are reporting good data, they should at the same time report what are the opportunities to manipulate the data which exist, and have we guarded sufficiently against those opportunities to manipulate the data. So we need to build in some of those kinds of safeguards. The other thing, of course, is you need to ensure that your bonus arrangements are not somehow or other seeking to suppress the bad news. I mean, if your bonus arrangements are focused on minimizing the number of injuries, then organizations will minimize the number of reported injuries in various ways, but you may not be reducing the number of injuries, you may be just repressing reporting. And if that's the way you're organized, then you are not embracing the red. So you've got to make sure that your systems are not designed to suppress the bad news. It's not easy, but it can. This is what high reliability organizations do. They find ways to celebrate the bad news and to challenge the good news.
Thank you, Professor. Another question here, interesting one from Ivan. Do you think that the lessons learned from those big events and for the standard can be cascaded to other industries like oil and gas and chemicals, for example? What kind of advantage can the other industries take from those events?
Theoretically, these lessons are readily transferred from one industry to another, because the root causes of all these accidents are organizational. And these organizations all function in similar ways, and they all fail in similar ways. If you look at these accidents that occur in the aviation industry, the root causes are very similar to accidents in oil and gas or in the mining industry. So there's much to be learned by looking at other industries. However, most industries don't understand this, and they don't look at other industries. They look only, if they look anywhere at all, it is only within their own industry. And so they're blind, or they're blinkered to some of the important lessons that are available to other industries. I mean, I think one of the industries that we can learn most from is aviation. It's been best studied. I suppose it's one of the reasons it's so important is because when you have a major accident in the aviation industry, you can kill many hundreds of people, and those people are likely to be very important people. They may be politicians, so this becomes a massive crisis, and so safety, or aviation safety, is probably more, let me change that, the prevention of major accidents in the aviation industry is much higher priority than the prevention of major accidents in the oil and gas industry or the mining industry. But we can certainly all learn from the aviation industry.
Thank you very much, Hopkins. There is another question here by Lucas. He is asking, what do you think about the criminalization in major accidents like Brumadinho? Do you think it would contribute to safety in some point?
Interesting question. I don't think that punishing people after the event is all that effective. These events are rare on the whole. It's much better to use sanctions, punishments of various sorts, when people are failing to comply with the safety requirements. They can be more easily applied, they can be not as severe, and they can be more effective for that reason. But when a major accident is very rare in any one company, and so when it happens and individuals are prosecuted, there is a sense in which they are scapegoated. There's a sense in which they're scapegoated. And there's always a sense of unfairness about it, because certainly most individuals are operating within a context, a broader context, which is set for them by the capitalist system, by the systems of incentives that operate in the market. And those are massive constraints, and people are all working within those constraints. And you have to understand those constraints if you want to prevent these accidents from happening. And so I think there's a rather limited role for punishment of people in these circumstances. I think I've talked previously about the idea of accountability without blame, responsibility without blame. And that's, I think, quite an interesting idea, that you really want to hold the top people, the CEO and the board, accountable, and therefore there's going to be consequences for them, but without necessarily being blamed or criminally prosecuted. So there are some very interesting kinds of middle ways here, I think.
Professor, final one. We are on time already. Thank you so much. I wanna already thank you for the time. We see in the aviation, for example, we have at least the feeling that the aviation industry learns from their mistakes, and the flights are becoming safer. If we take the past events as a reference. But the same doesn't seem to be happening in the mining. For example, we see a big sequence of events and similar ones what are the mining industry missing in the learning process?
Why the difference? First of all, there are changes. There are fewer people being killed in mining accidents now than there were a century ago. At least when underground mining, I'm speaking particularly of coal mining. When you had an underground explosion 100 years ago, you might have had 100 people killed. Whereas now you have an underground explosion, you may have 10 people killed. And the reason is because mining has been mechanized. And so mechanization and automation are going on in the mining industry in general and resulting in basically safer workplaces. So that's one thing. But I think, I guess more specifically, the answer is that the consequences now are not so severe. They don't threaten the very existence of the company. And that's why these companies don't learn. It's only when there's a real existential threat, when the company is threatened, its very existence is threatened, that it is able to learn these lessons. The example that comes to my mind is BP. They had a major accident in a refinery at Texas City in 2005. I think they killed 14 or 15 people. But it didn't cost the company a significant proportion of its overall revenue. It was not a threat to the very existence of the company. However, Macondo was. The Deepwater Horizon accident nearly destroyed BP. And it was only because it had such a shock that they reacted the way they did and learnt lessons and made some major reorganizational changes. And I think that's unfortunately the fact of the matter. It's only when companies, their very existence is threatened, that their top people will really take seriously the question, what lessons do we need to learn and what changes do we need to make?
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Gilles.